Hi, this is Wendy Lightheart, and today we're going to look at how to factor trinomials whose leading coefficient is not 1. So factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c can be done by grouping. So these are the steps that you would use if you are going to do this by grouping. The first step is to multiply the leading coefficient of a and the constant c together. Then you're going to take that product and list the factors of that product AC, and you list those factors until you find two factors that add to the middle coefficient of B. Once you find those two numbers that multiply to give you the product AC and add to give you the sum of B, then you're going to use those two numbers to rewrite the middle term BX using those two factors. So you'll be splitting that BX term into two terms, which will give you a 4-term polynomial instead of the 3-term polynomial that you started with. And then you're ready to factor by grouping. So here's our first example. The first step is to multiply the leading coefficient of A times the constant, which is C. So in this case, the A is 6 and the constant is -8. So if we multiply those together, what we get for the product AC is -48. Now we're going to list the factors of -48, and we're going to keep listing those factors until we find two numbers that add to -13. So we're going to list the factors on the left and the sums on the right, very similar to what we did when we were factoring trinomials whose leading coefficient was 1, but what we do with the numbers that we end up with is different. So first we need to think about the signs that we're going to need, just like before. So if we need the two numbers to multiply to give us a negative number, then they have to have opposite signs. And if we need them to add to a negative number, then we need the bigger factor to be the one that's negative. So we can start with 1 and -48, and when we add those together we get -47, which is not the sum we're looking for. So then we'll move on to 2 and -24, and when we add those together we get -22. And then 3 goes into -48 -16 times, so if we add those together we get -13. And this is the sum that we were looking for. So we're done listing factors because we found the numbers that work. And so what we do with those numbers is we're going to use 3 and -16 to rewrite the middle term -13x into two terms. The 3 and the -16 are going to be our coefficients. So here's that trinomial. Has 3 terms. Now we're going to break it up into 4 terms by splitting that middle term up into +3x and -16x. And the order of those terms doesn't matter. You could put the -16x first and the +3x second. Just make sure you have the signs correct on the right numbers. And notice that the 6x squared stays the same and the -8 constant on the end stays the same. You're just simply rewriting the -13x into two terms. So now we have 4 terms and we're ready to factor by grouping. So remember, the steps of factoring by grouping is that you group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together, and you factor out a GCF out of each group separately. So the first group, you probably have determined that the GCF is 3x, so we'll pull a 3x out of the first group. The second group, notice, begins with a negative sign, so we're going to pull out a -8 as the GCF in the second group. And the remaining factor in both cases will be 2x plus 1. The 2x plus 1 is our common binomial factor, so we're going to pull that out like we do a GCF, and then what is left over, the 3x and the -8, will go inside another set of parentheses as our other factor. So now this trinomial has been factored. And remember, you can check your answer by foiling this back out, and you'll see that you do indeed get 6x squared minus 13x minus 8 back. So let's look at another one. This trinomial 8x squared minus 10x plus 3 is a trinomial, and I should mention that you should always look for a greatest common factor first. And the last example there was no greatest common factor, and this one there's no greatest common factor. So after we've done that, then we notice that we have a trinomial and the leading coefficient is not 1. So this is the kind that we would use grouping to factor. So our first step, remember, is to multiply the a times the c. So for this one, the a is 8 and the c is 3. Multiply those together, we get 24 as our product AC. So then we need to list factors of that product. And so we're looking for two numbers that multiply to give us 24 and add to give us negative 10. So think about the signs. If they need to multiply to give you a positive number, that means they both have to be either positive or both numbers need to be negative. Which of those would give us a negative sum? Right, they would both have to be negative to get a negative sum. So we're going to make both factors negative, and we'll start with 1 and 24. So we have negative 1 and negative 24. Add those together, we get negative 25, not the sum we're looking for. So let's move to 2. Does 2 go into 24? Yes, it goes 12 times. So we have negative 12 times negative 2, and those add up to negative 14. Still not the sum we're looking for. So then 3 goes into 24, so our next pair we would try would be negative 3 and negative 8. Those add to negative 11. We're getting close, but we still don't have the sum of negative 10 that we're looking for. So then we try 4. 4 goes into 24 6 times. So if we try negative 4 and negative 6, those add up to negative 10, which is the sum we're looking for. I should mention that if you go through all possibilities, just like the other examples we were doing last week, if you tried all possibilities and you don't get the sum you need, remember that means your trinomial is prime. Okay, so now, what do we do with those numbers, negative 4, negative 6? Remember, we're going to use those as coefficients to split up that negative 10x in the middle up into two terms. So here's our trinomial. We're going to turn it into a 4-term polynomial by rewriting the negative 10x as negative 4x minus 6x. So now we have a 4-term polynomial and we're ready to factor by grouping. So we group the first two terms and group the second two terms and look for a GCF to factor out of each group. So the first group has a GCF of 4x that we'll pull out. And the second group begins with a minus sign, so we'll take out a negative GCF, and that GCF is 3, so we'll factor a negative 3 out of the second group. So when you pull a 4x out of the first group, you have 2x minus 1 remaining. When you factor out a negative 3 out of the second group, you should get a 2x minus 1 remaining as well. So now there's our common binomial factor of 2x minus 1. So we'll factor that out front like a GCF. And what's left over, the 4x minus 3, will go inside another set of parentheses, and our trinomial is now factored. And remember, you can always check your answers with FOIL to make sure you have the right answer. It's very common to make sign errors in these problems, so make sure that you check whenever you can, check your answer using FOIL. So that's our last example for today. Have fun factoring. Bye-bye.